So I'd like to have you, I want to talk to you a little bit about trauma screening. So I brought a screening tool for you, developed by the folks at the Child Trauma Assessment Center at Western Michigan University. This is being used right now in the child welfare and mental health system across Michigan and is being integrated into those public services as a standard screen they do. And my colleagues at Western that study trauma and have had a lot of federal grants around that have developed and normed this. So I want to help you understand it. So basically what this says is that if you look at under number 1, section 1 is exposure, okay? So simply when someone screens a child for trauma, they would check the areas that the child has had exposure. And then they would go down in the bottom half and they would look at behaviors, emotions, school problems, and relational attachment difficulties that were observed. Most often the screening isn't necessarily even used. It's not like you have to, the people that are doing it are a clinician that's doing an interview and asking. The screen's often done by a caseworker or someone who's well aware of what's happening with the kid, so they're just using it as a screen. It's not like, Lauren, I'm going to sit down and you and I are going to check this off together. It can be used that way, but it's not. It's used. I worked with one of the private agencies here in town, and they to support them implementing this across all of the kids that they served in their agency. They did child welfare, substance abuse, mental health. So in doing that, here's the results, and this is the part that I think can help, that I think may be helpful for you. If they endorse 4 or more of these under number 1, 4 or more of those types of things have happened to them, and 2 of the behaviors, that's the things in the bottom half, they're likely to experience, that's highly correlated with experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, or anxiety. So the screen is used in a social service agency or mental health setting to look at which children are most likely to experience trauma. Okay? So I want to give you a sense of, is that a helpful thing to understand? Yeah. Will you take the microphone?
In going back to the resilience measure then, just in terms of scoring and whatnot, how does the outcome, is there some place maybe at the resilienceresearch.org that shows the correlation between this and the probability outcomes that we looked at? You know, is there some sort of a scale that would help us understand our kids better?
What I can tell you is that the people that are studying trauma aren't doing this without doing something like this. And there are a number of different resilience scales.
Okay.
There isn't a companion to this, but folks that are researching trauma and looking at symptoms recognize that when kids have, so having 4 and 2 on this doesn't mean that you have trauma symptoms. It means that you're likely and should be assessed for those. And when those aren't in place, what they're finding is there are more protective factors and resilience factors in place. Those kids that don't develop symptoms are measuring as more resilient, and they can look in their environment and identify the protective factors that have prevented that. Does that help answer? So they do go together and they're presented. I learned a long time ago to not talk about this without talking about this, because everybody leaves with a really heavy heart and no hope. And the hope for the work that you're doing with young people is in the resilience factors and the protective, safe environment you create at your school. Other questions about that tool? Mark.
Is this the same as the CAFAS tool used in like community mental health?
So the question is this the same as the CAFAS tool? Mm-hmm. No, the CAFAS tool is the child and adolescent functioning functional assessment scale or something like that.
That's what we always used in mental health, and we would update it every 3
Yeah.
months with clients.
So what I understand, agencies that are using, CAPAS tool is a tool that is kind of standardly used in the mental health system in Michigan to look at functioning. The CAPAS does measure trauma, but it also, but what I know they're doing, for instance, where some of I prepare students to do trauma work, so I try to keep up with this through them. What the students are being trained in is they're trained to screen. Screening comes before CAPAS because CAPAS is an assessment.
Right.
Screening happens, sometimes a classroom teacher is
Initially,
even
yeah.
doing it, or a school counselor, and then the mental health system, they do the CAPAS. They're also using other specific trauma symptom
Okay.
measures as well as the CAPAS.
Okay.
So it goes, it's an alongside.
This is maybe just a connection where there are two families I'm aware of now where one of the parents was deployed overseas. Of course, we know the suicide rate for our servicemen and women is much higher, PTSD. So the kids I'm working with have kind of like a secondary trauma effect because their parents are depressed or anxious or have substance abuse issues, or it's just very hard to reintegrate back into the home. And the kids are now living with a parent that has many issues from being deployed.
Yeah.
So this just is a connection to all this to help me understand what they might be experiencing.
Yeah.
And they're bringing that to school.
So you'll notice that we probably think of the separation from lengthier separations from parents. Probably what comes to mind for many people is like, okay, they've been separated because of divorce, or they've been separated because of, for folks in the I work a lot in the child welfare system, so I think of foster care. This is that kind of separation as it's a pretty major risk factor in the stress. Imagine is a trauma exposure that it's both secondary and primary trauma. When you are, for kids, if their parent is in danger, it's the same as them being in danger. So living with a parent that is deployed and you turn on the news and you see about, IUDs, is that what they're called? And you see what's happening with that. That's a major stressor for kids. There's a lot of people doing additional work with supporting kids with military backgrounds. A resource for you, if you're a counselor, youth minister, teacher, there's a website, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, nctsn.org. This is that's the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, has anyone who's ever gotten federal funds to do research on trauma with children, that's a repository of their work. And when they get that federal funding, they have to create tools and resources for folks like us that translates their research and what they do. So if you go to that website, there's a whole section on trauma, on school issues. There's a section on giving resources. There's like I should have probably brought one for you. There's a guidelines for teachers. It's a one-page handout about how to engage kids that have experienced trauma. So the problem with these kinds of repositories is there's so much in them that you have to put you have to put aside a little bit of time. There's a good search mechanism in there. There's actually PowerPoint slideshows you can pull down, and all kinds of, there's curriculums for in schools, for doing groups with kids, that kind of thing. So there's a lot there. So it takes a little bit to sift through it, but it's really valuable. There's a section on different types of trauma. So if you have kids, a child that you know has been sexually abused or been physically abused, or you have, there's a whole section on natural disasters. So when we have had communities where there's been a tornado go through, where kids have experienced that, the NCTSN has folks that have studied that, and there's resources there. So it's a really good go-to for everyday resources that you can use in your work that will support your work, but you can also share with others. Okay? So I want to, maybe this is the time, let's take about just a few minutes break.